Hey, welcome back to the Coin Box. This is video number 1 in my series on the Mexican Onza and its varieties, and I'll be covering each of the 4 years it was minted. I'm super excited about this series as it's one I've been working towards and wanting to make for a long time. In this video, we'll take a look at the OG of silver bullion coinage, the 1949 Onza. But before we begin, take a second to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell icon to be notified of future uploads. All right, let's get started. Allow me to take you back to a time before any of the world's silver bullion coins we now know even existed. Back before we had the Australian Kookaburra, the Chinese Silver Panda, before the Canadian Silver Maple Leaf, the American Silver Eagle, and yes, even before the Mexican Silver Libertad. In fact, we still have to go back another 33 years before that, all the way back to 1949, the birth of the Mexican Onza. In other words, the world's first modern government-issued 1 troy-ounce silver bullion coin is now 75 years old. Even the Gold Krugerrand, which is considered to be the world's first modern gold bullion coin, wasn't issued until 18 years after the Onza. First up, let's talk about the design. On the obverse, we have the date, the name of the Mexican mint, and mint mark. The main design element is the bolt-in screw press, which has a fascinating history of its own, which I promise to cover in a future video. But for now, I'll just say that even though the machine itself was of British origin, the fact that it was used in Mexico and subsequently immortalized on various coins and medals, including the Onza, has made it a now iconic symbol of the Mexican mint. Its first appearance was actually 13 years earlier, in 1936, when it was featured along with a newer minting machine, a steam-powered coin press, on the medals commemorating the 400th anniversary of the Mexican Mint. The steam-powered knuckle joint coin press also has a rich history that spans multiple countries throughout a century, which again I hope to explore in a future video. The screw press design itself was almost certainly based on this photograph, which had been taken in the early 1930s, only a few years prior to the anniversary medals being issued. The coin press is said to have been destroyed shortly after the photo was taken. The initials under the screw press are those of the designer engraver Manuel Luna Negrete, who designed both this side of the 1936 medal and the 1949 Onza, so it makes sense that they both share this design. The reverse of the Onza is interesting because it expresses the silver content 4 different ways. First, it says una onza troy, 1 troy ounce, which is where it gets its name. In fact, in Mexico it's referred to as the onza troy to distinguish it from the onza libertad. Nowadays, it's pretty much a given that a standard silver bullion coin should weigh 1 troy ounce. But remember, all those other world bullion coins that we are familiar with didn't even exist yet. The troy ounce weighs more than an imperial ounce and is the standard unit of measure for precious metals. The term comes from the city Troyes in France and was standardized as being equal to 480 grains of barley, which is the second weight shown, 480 granos de plata pura. The next two go hand in hand and require some math because 1 troy ounce equals 31.1 grams, and as you can see, the Onza weighs 33.625 grams, but since it's 0.925 fine, if we multiply those two numbers, we get exactly 1 troy ounce of pure silver. So yes, even though the Onza is 92% silver, because of its extra size and weight, it does actually contain a full troy ounce of silver. And on the plus side, because of its extra weight, it has an exceptionally large 41.5 millimeter diameter with a reeded edge. The main design element on the reverse is a balance scale, which unlike previous balance scales on Mexican coinage representing justice, I assume this balanza was chosen more because of its practical use as a symbol of reliable and accurate measure. It's likely that the design was based on this scale, or one like it, which is currently at the Museo Numismático Nacional, or National Numismatic Museum, at the old Apartado Mint, which functioned as the Mexico City Mint from 1848 until 1992. So if you think about it, just about everything depicted on the reverse of the Onza is about weight and purity. Well, maybe except for the star and the denticles. And that brings us to one of the things I love so much about the Onza, the theme of the design. Some of the most common coin design subjects are people or historical figures, which are mostly busts and effigies, nature or wildlife, cultural and national symbols, and finally what I would call symbolic and artistic themes. These last two groups are not only my personal favorites, but I bet that if we were to compile the most popular coin designs of all time, The majority of them would also fit into these last two categories. The reason I prefer cultural, national, and symbolic themes on coins is that they artistically represent the nation and its history. In the case of the onza, the theme was chosen not only to broadly represent the country, Mexico, but more specifically to highlight its prestigious centuries-old institution, La Casa de Moneda, the Mexican Mint. Both sides complement each other well, precisely because they aren't two unrelated or disconnected designs put onto either side of the same coin. And yes, I'm taking a slight dig at American Silver Eagles here. They are two machines or apparatuses closely linked to the history and function of the Mexican Mint, and in a broader sense they represent the tools and processes used to produce the very coin on which they are displayed, which is also why I love the original 1936 medals. Even though newer technology was used to produce the onzas, you could say the screw press represents the mint's history and longevity, while the balance scale represents its high standards and precision of weight and purity. So in other words, it's a very focused theme, and I think it's cool that in a way, the design is almost like a self-portrait, in the sense that a coin press struck this onza featuring a coin press, almost like a photo of a camera or a painting of a paintbrush. The 1949 onza was in the works dating back to at least 1947, and we know that because there are pattern strikes with a mirror finish with both metal and coin alignment. In the end, they decided to go with the metal alignment on the 1949 onza, which is interesting because, as we will see in our next video in this series, they switched back to coin alignment for all the 1978 through 1980 onzas. Now, as far as the why and when these were minted, in the November 1949 issue of The Numismatist, Dr. Prideaux states that these coin-like tokens of 1949 were issued during the month of June 1949 by the Mexico City Mint and are intended to advertise the facilities of the Mexican Mint with the end in view of obtaining orders for future coinages to be struck in Mexico. Another reason was an easy way for disposing of a large amount of bullion in the vaults of the government. He goes on to say that they were originally sold in 1,000 lots at around 72 cents each, but by the piece they were being sold in Mexico and New York at $1. Now, there's a theory out there which I've heard of and read multiple times now, like in this Coin World article, saying that the onza was introduced in 1949 and struck intermittently with that date until new dates were used in 1978, 79, and 80. I assume that that theory comes from the fact that some Mexican gold coins, like the 50 peso centenarios for example, which were famously struck up until 1947 with different dates, but then since then there have been nearly 4 million restrikes issued, including between 1949 and 1972, and even beyond that, which were all struck bearing the same 1947 date. So perhaps it was simply assumed that the same was true of the 1949 onzas, but I have not found any documentation to support that claim. On the contrary, according to this 1950 annual report by the Mexican Mint, known as the Memoria de la Casa de Moneda, which covers all the mint's activity from the previous year, we can find the total mintage of the onza along with how many obverse and reverse dies were used. According to the report, there were indeed 1 million onzas minted using 18 obverse dies and 19 reverse dies for a total of 37 different dies, which we'll note again when talking about varieties. I don't believe the math adds up accurately here because it says there were slightly over 27,000 strikes per die pair. But you get that number by dividing 1 million by 37 dies. But since it takes 2 dies to strike each onza, we would need to divide 1 million by a total of about 19 die pairs, which would come out to 52,631 strikes per die pair, which is still just an estimate because that doesn't fully account for the possibility of one die being switched out before the other. But I think we could safely estimate about 50,000 strikes per die pair. And that brings us to varieties. I'll preface this by saying that neither NGC nor PCGS recognize any 1949 onza varieties, and I'm unaware of any published or documented varieties from any other source. Now, with only 18 obverse and 19 reverse dies used on the onza, and with such a relatively low mintage, and then on top of that, if we consider the fact that they were all struck within about 1 month's time, it makes sense that there haven't been any varieties discovered. But maybe that's about to change. I'm going to show you some varieties I found on the 1949 onza, but whether they are significant or not will be up to you to decide. I had a relatively small pool of 1949 onzas to analyze, which consisted of 9 of my own onzas, images of Scott Dahl's onza, plus the publicly available images of the 3 onzas on the PCGS website for a total of 13 onzas. And even though I scoured the internet and compared a large amount of images of other onzas, By no means is this an exhaustive comparison, but hopefully what I'm about to show you will be informative nonetheless. Now in this Onza series, there are 3 main categories of varieties that we'll be discussing. I will list them here in order of importance or significance, which incidentally is also the order of my favorite to least favorite kinds of varieties. First up, we have design varieties, which are my favorite since they involve a difference in the design itself. Whether intentionally different or not, the end design was engraved with variances during the dye preparation process, which resulted in the Onza having a slightly distinct design. I also really enjoy overdates and double dyes because they are mistakes, so to speak, which technically weren't supposed to happen, and yet they did. In their own way, they tell a story and give us a glimpse into the dye preparation process. They tend to be fairly clear-cut and objectively observable varieties, which I appreciate. Then we come to date or digit position varieties, as I call them, which are my least favorite for several reasons. They aren't a mistake or something that wasn't supposed to happen. They are a perfectly normal part of the dye preparation process and are even expected at times. They are simply the result of punching in a digit in a slightly different position within the date when compared to other dyes of the same year. The result is that some numbers might be slightly higher or lower or slanted, for example, which means they tend to be more subjective varieties, which I don't care for as much, which is why this is the least interesting variety category to me. Okay, so let's start by looking at the obverse of the Onza, and what I've done here is I've stacked several images, and if I cycle through them, you can see the lighting changes, but really nothing really changes. This one here is Scott's Onza. Nothing really changes on the Onza itself. Lighting sometimes looks like something changes and then it's really, really hard to line them up perfectly. So there might be slight shifts, but overall they're basically the same. If I cycle between them here, you can see how, they're different Onzas, but it's basically the exact same dye variety, so to speak. Now all of these, and I will go ahead and say that the majority of the ones I've seen online, most of the 1949 Onzas are this is the normal date variety, and I'll just go ahead and say it now. The only differences I've seen on the 1949 Onza have to do with the date and especially the number 4. So all of these line up with the 4. I put a red line there, and don't worry, I'll get a closer shot of this in just a minute here so you can see more clearly, but the 4 lines up, the outside of the 4 lines up with the inside of that denticle. If we continue going here, we see a slight shift, for example here, on that line. You see that line slightly shifted, and then we can go again, and you can see another slight shift. This one's inclined a little bit. Now these aren't huge differences. I'm not saying these are each an independent variety. I'm just pointing out right now basically what I found, and then I'll summarize it at the end here. But you can see the 4 shifts. Now this is a definitely a much more clear and obvious shift of the 4. And you can see here that the line now lines up almost with the back of the denticle. Now I want to show you full screen here so you can see that the Onzas, as I shift through them, as I shift through the pictures, the Onza itself, everything else, the inscriptions, the design itself is basically the same, and you see more of a shift on the 4. So if I take you back, you see that shift of the 4 there? Basically everything else is the same. Nothing really changes except the date. The 9 shifts a little bit, but not very much at all. But the 4 shifts quite a bit. So let's go in a little closer here. Okay, so now that we're closer up here, we can see things better. This is the normal date. We can call it a straight 4, but it's just the normal date. I can show you here that if the 4, if we were to grab it and drag it down here, it would line up, it would fall right into this, this slot, we can say, of the denticle. Okay, so it fits right there. And visually, that's just what it looks like. Okay, if you were to drag it down, if it were to go straight down, it'd go right into that slot. It's almost custom made for it. And that's the normal date of, that's what the normal 1949 date looks like. Now as we cycle through these, you can see it shifts over. And you can see how the line will shift over on some of these. It may look a little more dramatic here, but when you're looking at coins, even in hand, sometimes it's not as obvious. So sometimes close-up images like this make something look more obvious than it is. But again, we'll get to that in just a second here. So then we have another 4 here, which is also shifted, but not the exact same angle. So you can compare those two there. see? And if we compare the previous two, this is what those look like. We take that off, turn that on, there we go. So these two, that's the difference in angle for the first two. And then we can get an even, you know, slightly different angle with these here, and see how that's almost parallel. It's just shifted over in relation to the denticle. Now you'll sometimes see the 9, this second 9 shift a little bit, but again, there's nothing major there. For the shift of the 4 is much more obvious. Then if we continue going, this is the most obvious shift of the 4. And again, if we were to grab this 4, you can see the line there. If we were to grab this 4 and drag it, this would fall on top. It no longer falls in here. It's quite a dramatic shift. So this one falls on top. This one is much more obvious to me, and this is the one I would argue for could potentially be its own variety, because you can see a clear difference between this 4 and this 4. That's a very dramatic difference, and you can see nothing else really changes that much in the date. This again, this second 9 shifts maybe a little bit, but it's really the 4 that has the largest shift. So again, this first 4, that's in line with the denticle, and if we were to drag it down, it would fall right in the crevice there. This is the most common date from what I've seen. In my pool of onzas, it was most of them are this this alignment, and then I only have one of this one, which is quite a major shift. But I've seen more online, so it's not like it's necessarily a rarity. There are others available, and so it's not just this one. I have seen others like it, but there's a very clear difference between these two. If I bring you know, you can see both of them there. That's kind of the shift that you can see between both of these. So this is overlaid. This is with the 4 in line, and then the 4 shifted over. You can see that the other digits don't really change all that much between one and the other. So that's as far as the obverse is concerned. All of these, again, these are my least favorite kind of variety, because it's not a design variety. It's not, they aren't overdates, they aren't double dyes. It's just date position varieties where a 4 is slightly off. But you know, we'll take what we get on the 1949 Onza, since there aren't very many varieties, or actually any varieties out there that I am aware of. Now, there is one more image that I want to show you, and that would be this 1949 that I found on PCGS's website. So they have images of 3 different onzas that they've graded. What's interesting about this one, it is slightly slanted, but there are other ones like this one here. You know, it looks similar. What's interesting about this one is two different things, I would say. One is that it looks like it could potentially, we can even zoom in here, it could potentially be an overdate. So a 4/4, it's kind of hard to see. And again, this is not an onza I have in hand to examine it well, but it looks like it could potentially have, and if I take the line away, you can see right here also, there's a potential for this to be a 4/4. Now, none of my onzas, I haven't really seen others like this one, so I'm not sure if it's just something in the lighting, something on the onza itself, or there are potentially more onzas out there, more 1949 onzas with an overdate in the 4. Now, the other thing that's very interesting is just how far away the 9 is in relation to other ones here, if I show you here. See that? The 9 is pretty far away. Now, it's interesting here, if I go back to the other wide shot, you can see that I had a hard time aligning this onza. I was like, what is up? And then I realized, if you can see the edge here, you can really see quite a bit of the edge of the coin, which means, PCGS is giving away some tricks here, they lifted this side of the coin of the onza to get a better photograph, which they wanted the light to reflect off of the face of the onza to be able to get some of this color here and for that to show up better in camera. So what they did is they angled the onza towards the camera, which means this is not a straight on image, which means we cannot overlay this perfectly, which means it's also hard to to make much of the angles and all that, because we don't know how distorted this image is. Having said that, it is interesting just how far that 9 shifts. You can see that there. The 9 definitely shifts out quite a bit. Now the 9, since there's no straight lines on the 9, it's all curves, It's really hard, even, I would assume, even in person, if you had both of these side by side, to be hard to tell. Whereas the 4, since there is a straight line and it matches up, one matches up perfectly with this denticle here, there's a clear difference between this 4 and that 4. And here's another way of looking at it. This is the normal 4 that's in line with the denticle there. And if we overlay the other 4, that's what it would look like. So that's quite a big shift, and it is noticeable because you can definitely see when the 4 is in line to fit right here and when it would fall directly on top of the denticle. Now, as to the why the differences are specifically in the 4 and maybe even the 9, I don't mean to spoil anything, but you'll see that a lot of the differences in the future Onza videos, a lot of the varieties have to do with the second 2 digits. In other words, so not the 19, but the 79 or 78 or 80, etc. So in this case, it makes sense that it's the second 2 digits. And we might ask ourselves, well, why the second 2 digits and why the 4? Well, potentially, this is just a guess here, but it may have been, and this tends to happen across other series, that since this was minted in 1949, they had potentially thought of continuing with the Onza in 1950, and in order to do so, they would need some master hubs potentially to just have the 19 and the whole design. And then they would use those to make eventually dies with a different date, so 1950, 1951, etc. Which might explain why there are variances, differences in the 49. So maybe everything else was hubbed in and then the 4 and the 9 were punched by hand. I don't know, but that's an explanation, a potential explanation for why the differences are specifically in the 4 and a little bit in the 9. On the reverse, once again, I have several images here we can look at. This one's Scott's, this one's mine, and these two are essentially identical. I'm going to zoom in here on the weight, specifically the 33.625, especially the second 3, although there is some movement in the third 3. And you can see that this second 3 has a little mark there, kind of like a cap, and you can see Scott's also has that same cap. And if we continue here, you can see now both of them have it. So there are slight differences here. They both kind of shift up, and then this 3 definitely shifts higher. So if we compare the first image to the last image, you can see quite a big movement there. And you would think that this was some sort of 3/3. It's not an overdate, but a repunched digit or something like that. I don't understand why though, because it's not like it's a date that was going to change. It's the weight that they went with, unless they had potentially tried a different weight and that's a different digit under there that then they repunched here. I don't know. I don't really have an explanation for that. But whatever the reasons, these differences are not significant enough, in my opinion, to merit their own varieties. Personally, I have a pretty straightforward criteria for determining whether a variety is significant or important enough to be recognized and considered as an independent variety. In my opinion, varieties should be reasonably easy to identify. That means that a new variety should be both unique and clearly identifiable, preferably obvious enough to be identified with the naked eye. Now, don't get me wrong, I use my loupe all the time, especially when looking for varieties on coins I have in hand. But the problem is that we don't always have coins in hand. So I still think that a variety is significant when it's clear enough to be identified even without a loupe. And there are 2 main reasons why I believe this is important. The first is that if we really wanted to, we could put coins under a microscope and potentially find a fairly large number of tiny differences between one coin or die and another. But honestly, they'd all be insignificant differences and not worth making a distinction between. I've seen people do this, and honestly, it's quite exhausting. So there has to be a standard by which we can draw a line between those differences which are significant enough to actually merit their own variety, and those which are not. If there's a difference obvious enough to be noticeable without amplification, then that means it can be more readily identified and distinguished from other varieties. The second reason is that, much like many of you, most of what I buy is purchased online. So whether you're buying from an online auction, a forum, or social media site, all you have to go on are the photos of the coin you're buying. So if a variety is so small that you can't even notice it on a good quality photo, what's the point? If you have to have the coin in hand and look at it under magnification, where's the fun in that? Part of what makes varieties interesting is that you are rewarded for noticing something that perhaps others did not. So in my opinion, the standard for a significant variety is that you should be able to fairly easily identify the variety with our eyes or a loupe on coins we have in hand, and we should also be able to identify the variety from simply seeing a clear photo of the coin online. That means that the variety needs to be significant enough to be both identifiable and unique. Are there exceptions, like for really small coins? Sure, but generally speaking, that's how I feel about it. So based on that criteria, I would say that there aren't any significant differences on the reverse that I am aware of, and on the obverse we can see a progression, so to speak, of the 4 shifting over. But I would suggest that if we were to deem any of these significant enough to merit their own variety, it would be the one with the most marked difference. It's pretty easy to identify on its own, even without comparing it to the other one. I wouldn't call them wide or narrow dates, since the dates themselves don't move that much, so something simple like normal 4 and shifted 4 might work better. As far as the potential 4/4 variety with the far or wide 9, I'm curious to know if it will show up in any of your collections. So let me know in the comments below which of these 3 you have. As for the current value of the 1949 onzas, I will say that the cheapest I have paid for one is $50, but on average, depending on the condition, you can find them for between $70 to $140 raw. Remember that when these were first issued over 75 years ago, they were being sold individually for $1. Now, as an anonymous user on Reddit put it, I respect that they had the foresight to not assign a specific value to these, speaking of the 1949 onzas. An ounce of silver is an ounce of silver. I hate how American silver eagles are stamped with $1. I understand this was mandated by law when silver dollars were first minted, but it no longer makes any sense. And I've got to agree that it's silly that the nominal or face value on so many world bullion coins is completely detached from its actual value, which is why I'm really proud of the fact that both the onzas and libertads do not have a face value. They are actually worth what the market will trade for them, and in the case of the libertads, they don't need some silly symbolic nominal value arbitrarily assigned to them to make them coins. They are coins, they are legal tender, and their value is not dictated like fiat currency, nor do they need a face value that is essentially a joke anyway. Now, as for onzas, are they coins, tokens, metals, bullion rounds? Well, in my opinion, they are in a category all by themselves. They are onzas, the world's first modern government-issued 1 troy ounce silver bullion coin. Well, I hope you enjoyed this first video in my onza variety series. I hope it was informative, and who knows, maybe this video will lead to more varieties being discovered. Let me know in the comments below if you own the 1949 onza in your collection. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon to be notified of future uploads. And if you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a like and share it with a numismatic friend. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.